As part of the preparation for the centre being built, the churchyard had to be excavated, and John Buglass, our original archaeologist, thought he would discover about 50 sets of remains. He actually uncovered 150 plus.
Our job was to move in, and we had a machine to take the topsoil off in 3 areas, and we systematically excavated every single grave cut and every single set of remains or partial remains, because a lot of the graves intercut each other, so all you have left is maybe an arm or a leg from one body where a grave has been cut through that to put a new body in. Because the cemetery here has been used for probably the best part of 1,000 years, so there's an awful lot of people crammed into one relatively small area. Well, as part of the excavations we did here, we actually got the community involved who live and work around this area, and we had members of both the parish congregation and the wider community, people coming out from Harrogate as well, who were actually involved under supervision excavating some of the remains that we had found here. And then as a follow-on from that, because of the momentum that was created with that, we did quite a few bits of excavation in and around the area where the old vicarage is and the rest of the village that's now long gone, the village of Fewston that's disappeared. We had several archaeology days there and talks and presentations, and to look at the wider landscape and put it into more of its local setting.
When the centre opened in 2011, we had a series of evening talks by the archaeologists who reported on what they'd found from their initial partial research.
My role in the project was both to be on site and excavate on the site, as well as to oversee the skeletal analysis, to check any queries on the skeletons, and to bring the two together, to put the skeletons into their historical and their archaeological context. The most exciting part of the Fewston project was really to be involved with such an enthusiastic local community. The local community undertook incredible historical research that really added to the project and in fact informed the project massively. And as such, Fewston really is unique. The analysis of the skeletons and the skulls, one of which I've got here, provided a lot of information about this rural community. We had some named individuals, and the names allowed historical analysis on specific individuals, but the skeletal remains from Fewston, such as this one here, also permitted a real insight into the skeletal health of this population and diet of this population.
And in terms of the DNA, one of the things that we're really interested in looking at is comparing the oral bacteria that we find in the mouths of individuals from Fewston to our other populations around the UK. One of the interesting things about Fewston is that it's a rural population, and so it gives us insight sometimes into not only the oral health of people that are in rural populations and how that differs from urban centres, but also how our oral health changes through time, especially with the advent and the real increase in sugar consumption that happens in the Victorian period. So that's one of the things that we're looking at, is really understanding how people's oral health and oral bacteria have changed over this time period.
One of the exciting things that came out of the project, though, in terms of diet, was the pauper apprentices. So we knew that they had possibly come from elsewhere, and someone else looked at the isotopes, which can tell you about their geographical location. But we had a look at the isotopes for diet, and we were able to distinguish that group of adolescents from the adults in the population, because they looked like they were eating something else, because they'd come from somewhere else. One of the other things that was quite nice was we could see where socioeconomic status or wealth might have been manifested in the isotope signatures. So if you eat a lot of protein, you tend to be maybe a little bit more wealthy, and that distinguishes you from other people in the population. So quite a few farmers, quite wealthy farmers in the population, had higher nitrogen isotope values, which indicated they had a really good amount of kind of protein in their diets.
Most of the assemblages that we've worked with from the post-medieval period in particular are from urban environments, so we know quite a lot about what's going on now in the towns and the cities, but we don't really know very much about what's happening in these rural areas because so few or very little of them have ever been excavated. So the assemblage from Fewston gave us an opportunity to look more at what was happening in the countryside at this time of industrialisation, which is a period we're very interested in. Yes. My colleague Becky Gowland hosted some of the members of the local community who wanted to come up to Durham to find out more about what we do when we analyse human remains. So it's very interesting for us to be involved so closely with a group of individuals who were directly descended, some of them, from some of the skeletons that I'd been analysing. So that was quite an interesting connection.
So the paid archivist, Gillian Waters, worked with the team of 16 volunteers to develop the social history profiles, the biographies of the individuals contained in the assemblage.
I've been working as the archivist at the Washburn Heritage Centre for a number of years, and I have had access to and been cataloguing all the photographs that the centre has, access to documents as well, and maps, a huge collection of material. The researchers came from a variety of different backgrounds. Some of them had been family historians and had been researching their own family for many a year with real links with the Fewston Assemblage. So it's a variety of different skills and different motivations, but they were all inspired by the valley and wanted to contribute to the valley, even though their families had moved away perhaps a long time ago.
We felt it was important that each of the volunteers was paired up with one of the individuals so that they could focus their research on that particular individual.
Well, in my professional life I was a librarian, and when I first heard about this project, went to a meeting, I was given, if you like, Eliza Wigglesworth to research, and I had never done, I'd looked for information, of course, a lot in my life, but I'd never really done any family history. What I found particularly fascinating and moving when I looked at Eliza's life was she married young, she had 4 children, and she dies at the birth of her 4th child. Of her children, the youngest one, her son, dies at a 22-year-old in the First World War. Her 2 middle daughters both die fairly young in Hyroyd's Asylum, never have been married, no families. It's only her eldest daughter. So it was a very, from my perspective, it seemed such a short, brief life and nothing much after, really.
Joseph and Mary Downbrook were what I consider the head of the Downbrook dynasty. Joseph was from this area, but Mary was from the Batley area. Why Joseph went to Batley to find a wife, we never did find out. After their first child was born in 1819, they came back to live in this Fewston area and both farmed locally for the rest of their lives. Together, Joseph and Mary had 6 children. The 2 youngest died both in their 20s, and they became named individuals along with their parents. Joseph and Mary lived to a ripe old age and were buried together in the same grave, both in wooden coffins, which suggests that they did reasonably well in life.
I first joined about 2 years ago as a volunteer, and not long after there was a request went out for volunteers to research the family history of the people in the Fewston Assemblage. I was given Grace Hutton and her husbands and in-laws to research. There wasn't a lot more to be found out about Grace Hutton, but one thing that did affect me was the baby who died. It was the only baby we know of who died, Roland Margerison, when he was 10 months old, of whooping cough and fatigue, I think it was the words on the death certificate. When we went to Durham University to collect the remains and place them in their special sacks ready for reburial back at Fewston, they were in boxes and we had to put them into the sacks, and his was such a tiny little sack by the time it had been folded over that when we came home in 2 cars, there was rather a lot in the back of each car, and I said, I'll have him on my lap because he's going to get crushed. We had to leave the stuff at the archaeologist's house, and again I put him on the windowsill because I didn't want him to get crushed. When we did the first lot of reburials, The archaeologist couldn't find him and asked me where he was, and I told him, and he brought him the next time. So I was allowed to rebury him in the corner of one of the graves we'd already done. I later found, because the name Margerison rang a bell, that I was actually related to him. His great-great-grandfather was brother to my great-great-great-grandmother.
The time we suggested people would spend on the project has been exceeded by hours and hours and hours of diligent, almost passionate research work into the lives of the individuals in the assemblage.
No one was very keen on maps, it didn't seem to me, so I volunteered to look at the maps and locate the places associated with the assemblage. And it was very nice for the other researchers to see where their people had lived. And there are ruins of some of them that are not under the water. So I think the rest of the team found that quite nice.
So each of the volunteer researchers made a presentation about their individual, and I think everyone started off with a skeleton number. I was teamed up with skeleton 138 and 138A, and over the period of the research the skeleton numbers became people, became names.
Initially I became involved in the Washburn Centre because it was a place where we used to bring the dog for a lovely walk, and we happened to come in for a cup of tea. Then we joined the centre and responded to a request for volunteer researchers who might like to get involved. I wanted to make a piece which reflected the historical findings of the research, and I wanted it to be true to the age where we could make it true to the age. So I designed a system where the bands of colour each represent an age group, but each individual square represents one person. The colour bands vary from cream, where we're trying to indicate very young children under 5, through to reds and oranges where you're going up in age, right through to the older age group in purple for the 46 plus group. The people who were designing the squares each came up with their own idea of imagery that they thought would represent that individual. So we tried to make it unique to represent the 154 individuals concerned. And we were very fortunate that we had a living relative as part of the research team. So he was able to provide me with a map showing the exact location of where his ancestor had lived.
Well, the family is a large family, and in my generation I'm really the only lister male lister in the area, and I think that's how they latched onto me. Being a farmer and an auctioneer in Otley and having land in Timble, that was the local connection with George. I was amazed at the story, because it was obviously a unique thing for a living person to have this work go on with a named ancestor. So I was interested from that point of view, and also because I'm interested in local history and that kind of thing, added a bit more to my own knowledge and research on the subject. I heard first of all that there was some suggestion about a facial reconstruction, and then I was quite surprised when George was picked out as being one of the two candidates for the treatment. We had absolutely no photographic evidence and no drawings or paintings of him, so nobody had any idea what he looked like. It was entirely in the hands of the people from Liverpool, the face lab, who were working simply from the skull, and so it was a very interesting process to find out at the end of the day what they thought he perhaps looked like.
Now that the research has been completed into the remains and the artefacts that were exhumed for the centre to be built next to the church, now that that research is complete, we've moved on to another phase of exhibitions and interpretation.
This exhibition was an output from the HLF-funded project to build the Washburn Heritage Centre. Now, the construction of the Heritage Centre involved the digging of a huge hole in the churchyard, so it perhaps wasn't surprising that in digging that hole unearthed hundreds of human remains. My involvement with the Fewston Assemblage project was to work with the Heritage Group to look at ways in which we could interpret the findings and present them to as wide an audience as possible. And we decided to do this through a number of different routes, creating a permanent exhibition in the foyer between the Heritage Centre and the church, creating a book that summarised the findings and the processes that we went through in order to get those findings, series of walks which were created by Clive and his team, and of course this film.
We knew that there were going to be objects on display at Fewston, and they wanted obviously to look nice, but also to try and preserve them. Everything that I use here, it's conservation grade, which means it's long-term stable. So a lot of the objects were consolidated, the metals were consolidated, which basically helps to prevent further corrosion and helps them to stop deteriorating in the future.
Some of the research activities one might have predicted, such as the fact that archaeologists applied various complicated scientific techniques to the bones and to the coffin artefacts and pieces of coffin furniture, etc. Other kinds of research were a bit less predictable. For example, quite a number of us found ourselves collecting dandelion leaves in the churchyard, not entirely sure at the time why we were doing it, except that there was some scientific purpose to it. But I think, in effect, that was so that the archaeologists could compare whatever readings they got from things actually growing in the area now with the remains that they were investigating in order to find out whether those remains were probably of local people or people who had moved into the area from elsewhere.
So after 2 years hard work, which involved a lot of research, the project came to its conclusion on the 15th of September 2016. Here we are in the final resting place of the 154 individuals that were the Fewston Assemblage.
It was great to be involved at the end with the, in a sense, the final service. When Sally first mentioned it at a meeting, my first thought was, never done this before, never heard of one before, but I knew that together we could work something out that would, you know, have the local feel, but would be reverent. We would be putting the final remains back in the ground, and you know, we had to do that properly. I asked colleagues, they hadn't come across it before. There'd been individual reinterments. So in a sense it was a service by committee, but we were doing it with all the right reasons, taking due care in what we're doing, how we're doing it, and trying to think of you know, the different things that might not be right, and asking questions, is this okay? And the actual day, we were blessed with a lovely sunny day, and the service went very well, and it drew quite a number of people. I think there was getting towards 100 from those involved, past, present, as well as those from the diocese. And yeah, again, it was a good service to round off that part of the assemblage.
As part of the project, I asked the volunteer researchers to write a personal reminiscence, which we called the 100 Words. And it was their response to the project rather than the research they had found out about other people. I wrote a piece myself for that, and then realised it would make a suitable commemorative piece for the service of commemoration. So I rewrote it so that the last part of my piece would become the refrain which the choir sang on the day. And the first part of that, We Stand Here in a Speck of Time, has been taken up by the researchers and by the people here as the strapline. They find it significant to the whole project.
So although this marks the end of the Fewston Assemblage project, in some ways it's just the beginning of the next phase, where we hope that other living relatives will come forward, more information will be provided, so that we can add it to our collection of information that we already have that's contained in the ever-growing Washburn Heritage Centre archive.
The project has been very positive on the whole for the area. There's lots of locals as well as people from outside the valley and even outside the area who've come in for one reason or another, volunteers in the cafe, come to the exhibitions, the walks, the talks, and I've even been able to get to a few myself, and it's just been good to see what's going on and have a chat to people who've been involved.